God isn't crazy, but he does things that are crazy amazing. And this is the Crazy God Story podcast. My name is Chris. Today, I've got with me somebody from TikTok. That's where I met her. Her name is Ashley, and she has got a crazy God story. I mean, it really blows my mind to see what God has done in her life. And this one is going to hit some pretty mature themes. So if you've got small children, you may want to have them leave the room. She experienced some sexual abuse when she was small, didn't even realize it at the time, ended up kind of in a church situation that really wasn't healthy, and ended up as an escort even after realizing God is really real. She kind of walked away, but now she's actually a women's pastor and she's full on into ministry, and she has found radical healing from her past in God. And her story blows me away. I'm just amazed at how God can redeem us and heal us when no one else can. So how are you doing today, Ashley? Thanks for being here.
I'm great. I'm excited to be here. I love your content on TikTok, and I'm excited to have this conversation. I'm always excited to talk about God, and he is a little crazy. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, he's not insane crazy, but the things that he does, it blows my mind. I look at what he's done in my life and I'm just like, I can't believe that happened. Like constantly, I'm just like blown away. And I'm like, I'm not creative enough to make up the stuff that God has done in my life, so yeah. So tell us about your story, jump off wherever you want and go from there. People are usually like, where do I start? I'm like, the beginning.
Yeah, I always joke that you could do an HBO docuseries on my life, and it would be a multiple volume story. Yeah, I grew up pretty quintessential home life. People often think that women who end up being high-end escorts for 5 years have major daddy issues, and they come from a broken home, et cetera, et cetera. There's just kind of like this stereotype and this assumption about what a person who gets involved in that, who they must be, because of how they were raised. And I actually am none of those things. People are usually surprised to find out that my mom and dad have been married 46 years. They still make out and slap each other on the butt. There's no emotional abuse. There's no, Christ was the center of our home. I grew up in the country, pretty idyllic childhood. There wasn't really anything from my direct family perspective that shaped me in any way other than to love God and to chase after him. My dad was a deacon of a Baptist church. My parents were the music ministers there. I mean, we were in church, Wednesday night, Friday night, Saturday night, Sunday. I mean, Christ was just an ever-present part of my life. But even with that being said, I had some older friends. Most of my friends were a little bit older than me. I grew up in a really rural community. And so, it wasn't, you kind of were friends with whoever was closest to you in age. So starting when I was 4, I had an older friend who started sexually abusing me during sleepovers. And even when we would just hang out and play, what would happen was she would say, well, we'll play Barbies, but first you have to do this, or we'll watch a movie, but first you have to do that. And it was always sexual in nature. So my exposure to sexuality came very, very young. I remember that her mom had a book. It was like a very scientific book on sex and sexual positions and all of these things. And she would always want to be looking at this book. And these are just things that, really stood out to me. But scientifically, the younger you are exposed to that, the more, I guess, the easier it is for people to continue down that path, because it opens neural pathways in your brain that you're not supposed to open whenever you're a little kid.
When that was happening, because she wasn't that much older than you, I think you said you were 4 and she was 6, right?
Correct. Mm-hmm.
And so that was something that was happening to her. And so, at that age, kids are so malleable. They're so easy to shape. And so, things were happening to her, I think, that she probably didn't understand. And man, that's so terrible.
Yeah, yeah, and it went on until I was about 11. So I mean, a
Oh,
while,
okay.
6, 7 years. Um,
Okay.
it was, and I'm still friends with this woman to this day. You know, we've had some major conversations. Both of us have had to go through some therapy and some healing for many things, but it just kind of set off a domino effect of things in my mind that you know, I believe genuinely that the only authority that Satan really has over us is to get us to believe lies. So you'll go through something and there are elements of it that happen that are just lies, and you adopt them as truth, and then they become part of who you are. So the lie that I picked up in that situation was that sex and anything to do with sex was really a tool that you could use to manipulate people.
Wow.
Because while I was dealing with her, I mean, I was 5, 6 years old, and I'm thinking, well, if I want to play Barbies, then I do XYZ with my body with this girl, and I'm going to get to do whatever I want. And that was the lie, that if you want to get something or achieve something, then you use sex to manipulate the situation to get what you want.
Wow.
And that was something that became part of my makeup and the way that I approached life. You know, in kindergarten, first grade, I was really, really young. And so, you know, my mom and dad didn't have any idea. I think because something that I think about sometimes is whenever you're a genuinely good person, sometimes you don't realize how bad something can be that's going on right in front of you, because you yourself would never do that thing. So it kind of contributes to, you know, you're not looking out for it because you're like, well, it's my 5 and 7 year olds are hanging out. Like, what could they possibly getting into? They're 5 and 7, you know?
Yeah. Well, and part of the problem is, probably too is, no one knew what was going on to that other girl. I mean, that was,
Mhm,
except for the abuser. I mean, the abuser knew, but that's not, I mean, I know one of the things that abusers work at is hiding what they're doing,
mhm,
and they have a lot of power over that person in the way that, again, you were talking about the lies, how Satan tries to get us to convince things. Satan works through abusers to convince, who they're victimizing, that, of all kinds of lies. And so, you know, they start working to keep control over that person, and a lot of times convince them that it's okay, or that it's normal, or that really bad things will happen if people find out.
mhm.
Just, oh my gosh, that
Absolutely.
is crazy.
Yeah. So, you know, when I remember she got a little bit older, um, and it I honestly am not 100% sure what stopped the interactions, but it just stopped. It was like, you know, I was about 11 years old, and so she would have been about 13, and it just stopped. And I was thankful for that. I was also kind of confused because, again, I was young, and, you know, if this has always been your interaction with someone, now that element is missing. The part that's really dark, I think, I mean, all of it's dark, but I think whenever you start experiencing that young, and it becomes, there's like this constant tug of war between, you know, it shouldn't be happening, but there's also sensations and things going on in your body that you don't fully understand, you know. And so Satan is able to use something that's supposed to be beautiful and pleasurable, that God intended to be that way, and just twist it all up, because you're like, I know I shouldn't, this isn't something that I should be doing. It's definitely not something I should be enjoying. The dynamic of our relationship has been this for so long that now that it's gone, like, now it's almost like you're relieved because you're glad it's not happening anymore. You don't have to hide it anymore, but you're also feel a little bit of rejection, and like, what did I do that now this person isn't engaging with me on this level? Like, there's just a lot of very complicated emotions, and then you're then you're 11, you're hormonal anyway. So, you know, it was just a really complicated situation
Well,
for sure at that time.
and one of the other things that I think is really important to understand too is when you experience something like sexual abuse at a young age, your psychological mental progression is radically stunted. So,
Mhm.
as as a kid, you're supposed to like develop at a normal rate, and there's different, different people have different things that are not always like exactly neurotypical, but something like this, somebody at the age of 4 that experiences that, um, you stop progressing normally. You don't develop the way that that you're
Hmm.
supposed to. And so your emotions and everything aren't where they should be. So even by the time you're 11, I mean, yeah, like you said, you know that stuff shouldn't be happening. But then once it ends, like there's all kinds of emotions and things that are coming up that you shouldn't even be experiencing,
Hmm.
you shouldn't have to be processing. And I think it's really hard for people to think about. But yeah, and I mean, this is awkward to say, this is uncomfortable, but
Yeah.
this is an important topic, at that age. Yeah, when those things are happening, it is hard for a kid to say, yeah, okay, so this is wrong, but there's it feels good, there's something
Hmm.
about it. And man, I haven't had that happen to me personally, but it's something that I've dealt with in my life. And it's amazing, just amazes me at how much it changes a person's ability to develop when they
Hmm.
experience that. And just wow, man, just sorry, that's a lot to take in.
Yeah. It also, I think, something that I had to do a lot of through the years because of that particular reason is you also misunderstand what healthy boundaries look like,
Yeah.
even healthy physical boundaries for yourself. Because at 4 years old, you're pretty, even to a kid that's 6, just a little bit older than you are not able to really articulate, like, this is a boundary that I don't want you to cross, because it's consistently being crossed all the time.
Yeah.
And so having to step back and recognize, like, it is okay to say this is not what I want. It is okay to say that this isn't what I'm going to engage in. Those are healthy boundaries,
Yeah.
that had to kind of reprogram. So when that all came to an end, my life was still going along idyllically on the surface. Like I said, it wasn't. I was going to church and doing all those things, and then when I was 15, there was a very close family friend of ours who, he had been around my whole life. He's 16 years older than me. His parents and my parents were very good friends. And now looking back, he had been grooming me since I was pretty little. Like, he would sit me on his lap, do lots of things that abusers do to slowly prepare someone for whatever the abuser has in mind. And so, um,
And
you have
that's what is that called, Ashley? When someone is
grooming,
grooming, and that's an important,
grooming.
yeah. And so there's some things that
Hmm.
you're bringing up that I definitely want to come back and talk about. So, but
Yeah,
I want you to keep going, and
absolutely.
I want to go
So
back.
yeah, yeah. So I, I matured very, very quickly. I went from no boobs to big boobs when I was like 12. I've always been considered, this is always a funny thing for me to say because I'm looking a little casual today, but whenever I'm pretty. I've always been told I'm pretty. There's things that people have always said that. And so he would, starting when I was about 14, when he was around, his grooming tactics just became a little bit more aggressive. So he would stand really close to me. He would go out of his way to, like, touch my hair. He would make comments about my figure and what I looked like. And it was just this constant thing. So what ended up happening was, my mom and dad were out of town. He came to my house, and it wasn't unusual for him to be at my home. I mean, again, rural northern New Mexico, everybody, you don't lock your doors. He had been around me my whole life. So the fact that he showed up when my mom and dad weren't home wasn't odd. Like, I knew him, he came into the house, and then I won't go into the play by play, but he ended up raping me and saying that I had been teasing him with my body for years. What's funny about that, not funny, haha, just odd, is that I was 15. Like, how can a 15-year-old tease a grown man with their body for years? And so I lost my virginity to sexual assault. And one of the things that, back to the lies that you believe, is my mom and dad chose not to press charges against him because I grew up in such a small town. They felt that the stigma of being the girl that had been raped would have been so difficult in such a rural environment that they thought it would be better just to let him go. Now, hindsight, my mom and dad have said that that is not what they should have done. You know, they've had conversations and asked me to forgive them for that. It wasn't the right decision, because the lie that I believed through that was that, well, men can take whatever they want from you and there's no repercussion. And if there's no repercussion, then you might as well just give them what they want, because they're going to take it regardless. And so what happens is you have the lie that I believed from when I was molested as a small child, which was, if you want something, you use your body and sex to manipulate someone to get what you want. And you combine that with, well, men are going to take whatever they want from you, so you might as well give it to them anyway. And you have a recipe for disaster whenever it comes to your sexual identity, what you think sex is meant for, how you use sex to engage with other people. It becomes very toxic very quickly, because my interpretation of sex was no longer what God intended it to be. It was very much, you use this to manipulate men and to control situations so that men do not hurt you. And that is what sex is. That's what sex became for me. It was a manipulation tool that I kept in control of by giving it to who I want, how I wanted, in order to prevent myself from being hurt. And so, you know,
I want to,
go ahead.
okay, sorry. No, I just want to go back and kind of touch on some things that I'm hearing.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that's so important is boundaries. And one of the things that happens, and you see this at like family gatherings and stuff, and there's quite a few things in this that I think parents need to hear.
Absolutely.
Okay, so first off, I don't think you had mentioned it, but the little girl that started with you when she was 6, her father was her abuser, right?
Correct.
And so we, for years, have, in this country, talked, like when I was in school in like the 80s, we talked about stranger danger. Look out for the creepy man in the van, look out for the pervert in the bushes.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is, like, the overwhelming majority of predators know their victims, and not just like casually know, but it's like somebody that it is dads and uncles and grandfathers and aunts. And I mean, it is mostly men, but it is women as well, or, a neighbor or somebody that has a lot of access to somebody. And so one of the things that a lot of parents will do as a kid, grandma and grandpa will come over, and, little Sally doesn't want to hug her grandfather. And mom is like, no, you hug your grandfather right now. And she's saying, no, no, no. And that's so, like, I get that we want, our kids to have those interactions, but we need to teach our children that, first of all, their bodies are their own and they set their own boundaries. It is not up to, the uncle coming over, the aunt coming over to say, I want a hug and you're going to give it to me. I believe we need to be teaching our children that their voice matters, because when you tell your child that you're going to hug this person or sit on their lap or whatever it is that you don't want to, you're telling that child your voice doesn't matter. What you say, what you feel doesn't matter. And it is so dangerous, because predators, most of them are people that we know, and boundaries are so important. It's so important for kids to understand that they are in control of their body. Now, there's times when, okay, so, when you've got like a 2-year-old, mom has to give the kid a bath. I mean, there's things like that. Of course. We're talking about, other situations. Kids have to learn to use their voice. They have to realize, and they have to be told, hey, here's, talk with your children about healthy boundaries, and not just the stranger danger, but hey, if
Mhm.
anybody does anything, talk to me, let me know.
Right. Right.
You know, and
Absolutely.
you had brought up grooming with that guy, and there was like what I heard, there was so many things it seems like led up to, without him knowing what was going on, made you like this perfect target for him. And I hate to say it like that, but
Absolutely.
you had already kind of gone through that, and so your boundaries are already shot, right? And
Mhm.
you've already got your view of sex and boundaries and things like that has already been damaged by Satan. And let's be honest, this is all coming from Satan. This is
Absolutely.
all okay. So Satan himself, I don't think personally came after you, but this is like demonic, right? I don't,
Absolutely.
yeah. And
Yeah.
so, when he's grooming you and doing things like having you sit on his lap, you know, you've already been conditioned to reject like what would be healthy boundaries. Eh,
Correct.
Oh man, that's
And the other interesting thing to point out there is the interactions with this guy probably started when I was about 10, which was right before that void became present whenever I was 11 and the older girl stopped engaging with me in that context. So, speaking of boundaries, because there's that rejection from her, now there's a void where it even muddied the lines further because even in his micro grooming tactics, it was almost supplementing what I was missing from her from a psychological level. Um, and so things like I broke my leg in I had to have a cast that was a full leg cast all the way up to my hip. And my mom kept the cast because it has all my little friends like signatures and stuff on it. But something that I noticed, she gave this to me a couple years ago, and it was like somebody smacked me in the face because the man that raped me um, had signed my cast all the way at the top, very close to my private parts. And the signet, what he wrote on the cast was "your best boyfriend." I was like 9 when I broke my leg. He's 16 years older than me, so he would have been what, 26? And he's signing. And when I saw that, I was like, "Mom, like, did you think this was weird at the time?" And she was like, and my mom felt horrible. She was like, "No, I didn't think it was weird." But there are multiple situations that I could, for instance, with him, that he was just kind of preparing me. And because of the void that I had in that space, and because, like you said, he was very familiar to me. I had literally known him my entire life. And so, you know, that the those dynamics and those lies just became part of how I was operating. And so moving forward, like I said, my testimony is long, so we won't get into all of it. But
okay.
I ended up getting into, whenever I was 25, I got married to a man who was super. I'm always careful how I speak of him because we actually have an amazing relationship. But
Okay.
he's my older kid's father. I have 3 children. They're 18, 16, and then I have a 3-year-old. And so, but he is Latino. He grew up in a different country, very, very stereotypical Latin male, not very good with emotions, very he can just be a little bit difficult to deal with from an emotional perspective. And so our relationship, he was an atheist, I was a Christian. I wasn't walking with the Lord when we met. In fact, at that point, I'd experienced some serious church hurt, and I did not want to have anything to do with God at all. So, during that season, while I was married to him, he would just say the most emotionally abusive things. And finally, my son, who's now 16, when he was about 3, I was buckling him into his car seat, and my son said, "Mommy, daddy's really mean to you. And I felt like somebody had just smacked me upside the head. And my father said, Ashley, you're teaching your daughter that this is how men should treat her, and you're teaching your son that this is how he should treat women. And I think you need to get out of that situation.
Wow.
So I ended up getting divorced, and I was just in this place of like absolute confusion and brokenness, because clearly I'd had such dark things that had happened to me that led me to make some decisions that the Christian people in my life did not take the time to evaluate or understand, which resulted in some serious church trauma that caused me to not want to have anything to do with God. So Satan was consistently isolating me, is what was going on, from anything that could have essentially helped me. And then just blow after blow, because of that hurt and because I had never addressed those childhood traumas, I was continuing to choose men who were just very toxic and abusive in their own ways, which just continued to propagate this mistrust and almost disdain toward men. And so I then believed, because back to the lies, because of my ex-husband, my older kid's father, because of how he treated me emotionally, the lie that I believed with that was that men just aren't safe. I already know they're not safe physically because I was raped. And now I just don't think that they're safe emotionally either. And so it became the perfect storm for me to end up escorting. So after I divorced him, I was a single mom of 2 little kids, and I was broke, like syllable broke, like so broke that you
made
broke.
which sandwiches? You had bread and wish you had something to put in there to make a sandwich.
Yes, like I've said before, I was eating ramen without the seasoning. That's how broke I was, and so, but I've always had a very entrepreneurial spirit. I had started brokering contracts between music producers and record labels. It was slowly starting to take off, but I was broke, and I had gone to Las Vegas, Nevada to broker a contract for a music client of mine, had dinner with a bunch of businessmen. And at the end of this dinner, this gentleman walked up to me and he said, "Hey, would you have dinner with me tomorrow? I'll send my driver for you." He's like, "I think you're very articulate. You're very well traveled. And I have a business dinner. I think you'd be a great company for me." And I said, "Sure." So I go with him the next night. We have an amazing dinner. Nothing happened. He sent me back to the car. The driver took me back where I was sleeping. And when I got out of the car, this man handed me an envelope with $1,200 in it, the driver. And I was like, "Well, what the heck is this?" And the driver's like, "I don't know. The gentleman just told me to give it to you." And I was like, "What the heck?" So I called him and I said, "What is this $1,200? And he said, "Oh, well, I thought that you were an escort." And in that moment, I was actually offended, because I'm like, "Well, what did I do that made you think I was an escort? Like, I didn't do anything sexual. I hadn't said anything provocative. I wasn't dressed like a hoe, like none of that." And looking back, I think he knew I wasn't an escort. I think he recognized a desperation and a brokenness in me that I didn't realize was so evident. And so what he said on that phone call, he's like, "Well, do you need the money?" And I was like, "Well, yeah, I need the money." And he's like, "Well, just take the money. Like, no big deal. I'm sorry. It is what it is," kind of like laughed it off. And I was like, "Okay." But then a couple weeks later, he called me and he said, "Hey, if I paid you $3,000 a weekend and flew you here to Vegas every other weekend to go to these business dinners with me, would you go?" And again, I was so broke, and I was like thinking to myself, "Well, what's there? No harm, like what difference does it make?" Sure, I'll go to dinner with you. So he would fly me. I was living in southern New Mexico at the time. He'd fly me from El Paso to Vegas every other weekend, and I would go to fancy dinners and stay in amazing hotels. And he was paying me $3,000. I mean, I was making $6,000 a month to have dinner with this guy. Like, the funny thing is, though, Satan is sneaky, man. Like, people think that you just fly off the escorting cliff all in one foul swoop. That's not how it is. It's like a trickle down. It's like you absorb more and more and more until it's an elephant in the room, And so the first probably 3 months of that, there was no sex involved at all. It was literally just me having dinner with this guy, and I was using the money to build my business with the music clients. And I'm like, well, this is great. So about 3 months in, he's like, hey, if I pay you $5,000 a weekend, will you have sex with me too? And I'm thinking to myself at this point, because of everything that I've explained to you, like, sex was not a big deal to me. What I'm thinking is, because of the lie that I believed when I was a little kid, this is great. I'll just use sex to manipulate him to get more of what I need from him. And he's going to take it if he wants it anyway. So I might as well give it to him because of the lie that I believed being raped. And this allows me to engage with him. The third lie, this allows me to engage with him without emotionally being open and vulnerable because I don't feel anything for him. So it was a very easy transition for me because I had all this warped sense of what sexuality was. And unbeknownst to myself, that unlocked a door that I had never intended to go through. And I ended up escorting for 5 years. So high-end escorting, there's a couple things that I try to be very transparent with people about. I do not ever want anyone to think that high-end escorting is anything other than prostitution, because it is absolutely prostitution. You just wear nicer clothes and you engage in behaviors in much nicer environments. But I think that something that I try very hard not to do is not to make it sound pretty and glamorous, because there's nothing appealing about it. It's very dark. And the other thing is that, but there is a distinction. Most of the time, high-end escorts, you're not with a different person all the time. Usually it's very, very wealthy businessmen who pay for your exclusivity and your silence. So you'll see the same man 3, 4, 5 months until he's bored of you. Then he will literally pass your information on to his other colleagues who also use those services. And you kind of end up operating in this network of very powerful businessmen who use those types of girls. And so it's an interesting place to be in, because if I was this man's escort for 3 or 4 months and he doesn't want me anymore because now he wants a blonde, he'll go on to a blonde. And now I'm escorting for his business partner, and I'm still at dinner with the man that I was an escort for 6 months ago.
Wow.
It's a very bizarre world, because you literally become a commodity. They're trading you just like they're trading stocks. And you see the same people over and over. You end up knowing who the other escorts are. You operate just kind of in this world of fictition on some level. But the thing that is the most difficult, I think, is you genuinely just become an object. And it's like a car. Like, I don't like this car anymore, so I'm going to trade this car in for a blue car. Well, so now I'm the red car. I'm with a guy that likes the red car, but in 3 months he may decide he wants a purple car. And but you're all parked in the same garage. The drivers just change.
Wow. Man, this is
So,
just making my head swim, like, not in a good way. I mean, this is just, I can't imagine living like that and going through that. And I mean, it's what amazes me, like, one of the things, like, this pattern in your life where Satan found this place to get a root hold, to get this stranglehold in your life starting when you were 4. And it was this theme, and he attacked you in one very specific place in your life. And so he attacks you in your sexuality at a point where a 4-year-old can't wrap their head around that stuff. You shouldn't be thinking about that stuff at 4. You shouldn't be experiencing that stuff at 4. I mean, 4-year-olds, okay, so you're starting to be curious about your body, and, like, that's normal. Like, I'll say that, like,
yeah.
that's normal, you know, but, like, this is, like, completely different. And everything just keeps like, I'm blown away because like you've got, I mean, in Ephesians 6, it says, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against
Hmm.
powers, principalities, and spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly realms. And there are demonic forces at work that look at our lives that try and direct us down paths and things like that. And I mean, you've got an enemy that just keeps steering you down this road. And now is, like as jacked up as it is, you're getting rewarded for it, financially pretty well. And
Hmm.
you've got the mentality to where, I mean, you're just like, holy cow, I'm just, wow.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the thing is too, one of the things you said, you talked about how that first guy, when he said, oh, I thought you were an escort. And you said, you don't think he really thought you were, but he recognized something in you. And I think one of the things with predators, they, it's kind of like, when lions are out hunting, and this is, I think, a pretty accurate
Hmm.
analogy. When lions are out hunting, they're, a herd of gazelle or whatever, they're looking for the ones that are injured or sick or
Hmm.
lame, or the ones that are easiest to attack. And I don't know what it is, because one of the things you said is you kept going after the same like kinds of toxic men. And
Hmm.
there's something that happens with us where, you know, people that have been abused or have been victimized or that have, you know, the kinds of things that you've gone through, people who are predators are going to look for things where they can manipulate. I mean, honestly,
Absolutely.
that was just a more advanced form of grooming.
Hmm.
I mean,
Hmm.
that's really what I mean. That's what, again, this guy was doing. He was grooming you. He knew you were an
Absolutely.
escort, so he groomed you to get you to the point where throw a little more money at it and sure, but man, I think that's something that's important to point out too, is that, you know, people who are predators do look for certain traits. They're going to look for, is this person a person I can victimize? Oh my gosh. Wow. This is like, I know your story has a good spot now, but this is really, really hard to hear. And it just rips my heart out, as the father of three daughters. Like, I hear this and it's so like just soul crushing to hear this stuff, because when we talk about sexual abuse in America, it's, I think, a lot more prevalent than a lot of people even understand. When you look at the statistics, it's estimated that 1 out of 5 boys have been sexually abused as a child at some point, and 1 out of 3 girls have been sexually abused at some point before they turn 18. I mean, that is a staggering number. And it blows my mind because of the way that it affects people's development, the way it affects they mature. It affects so much in our lives. And it's something that just, aside from like radical healing, I mean, there's stuff that it keeps going, and it creates unhealthy patterns, and it brings death, destruction, and chaos into our lives, you know? And wow. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
This is,
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And it is interesting that Satan, I think he does this with all of us, right? I think there's elements of all of our lives that for whatever reason, there's like that thing that we just struggle with a lot. So some people it's alcoholism, some people it's deception, like they just can't be honest for whatever reason. Some people it's like in my situation, the demonic forces have always come after my sexuality. And you know, uh I'll speak on that a little bit more in just a minute, but I would say that for me, growing up though, knowing the truth. I mean, I gave my life to the Lord whenever I was a little kid, 5 years old. I know that I accepted Christ in that moment. It's one of my core memories. It's a very clear memory the day that I gave my heart to Jesus. I was in my mom and dad's bedroom and I told them I needed to make Jesus Lord of my life. I remember their bedspread. I remember my pajamas. Like I remember all of it. So I know that I had an encounter with Jesus at that time. Um, And through the whole time I was escorting, and I mean, keep in mind, I was traveling in and out of the country. I was traveling to crazy cities. My parents didn't know where I was half the time. I was lying to them. It was just a mess. But throughout, God would never leave me alone. Like this guy, I say all the time that he's the hound of heaven. Like he will come after you. I will never forget this my whole life. I was flying from Chattanooga, Tennessee to Nashville. And there was this old guy sitting next to me on the airplane. And I was dressed like high-end escorts don't look like hookers. That's the other thing. Like you are very well put together. You look like a businesswoman most of the time, unless you're in Vegas or something. So I looked like an attorney or something. I'm sitting on this airplane, the guy sitting next to me, and he was very clearly uncomfortable the entire flight, like very fidgety. He wouldn't look at me. I'm like, what is this guy's deal? Like, I know I don't stink, like what's his problem? And we land the plane, and finally he looks at me straight in the face and he says, I never do this. I can't believe I'm going to do it now. But God wanted me to tell you that you are on a path that you're not supposed to be on. This is not the plan and purpose he has for your life. And you need to stop what you're doing and come back to him now. And he loves you so much. And then he gets up off the airplane and like beelines it off that plane because he was so uncomfortable with delivering that message. And I'm sitting there like, whatever, God, like I'm just not gonna, I don't care. I'm not gonna do that. And then another story that's on my TikTok is one night I was in Las Vegas. I'd flown there to be with this guy. This was a one-off guy. Like this wasn't one of the guys that I had seen consistently, but he flew me to Vegas. He was a professional poker player, and I was in a hotel, and I flew there, met up with him. We had done our thing. Then he went downstairs to play poker, and I went to sleep, and I was completely knocked out of sleep. And probably around 3 a.m, I woke up from a dead sleep, like from completely asleep to wide awake. And I just felt in my gut, Ashley, you have got to get out of this hotel room right now. And I was like, well, that's weird. But, I just felt this overwhelming sense of urgency. And so I get up, I threw my tennis shoes on, I grabbed my ID and just, just absolute essentials. And I go out into the hallway of this hotel. And I felt that check in my spirit again, like, you can't go out this way. It's not safe. And I'm thinking, well, how the heck am I supposed to get out? Like, this is the door into the room of this hotel. Like, how am I supposed to get out? And I'm like talking to myself, I'm like, the only way out is through the balcony other than this door. And so I was probably 4 or 5 stories up. I go out on the balcony and I'm like, I can't get down from here. Plus I'm afraid of heights. So there's that. And what it ended up, the balconies were like next to each other, but there was a partition. So they were connected in the front, but you couldn't just walk from balcony to balcony. But I felt such an urgency that I had to get out of that room, and I couldn't go out the front door, that I ended up crawling from one balcony around the partition to the next, and then one more balcony over. So I was like 2 balconies away from the room that I was in. And I just huddled in the corner on this balcony, and I'm just sitting there kind of confused, like, what are you even doing out here? This is crazy. And I was probably out there for 2-3 minutes, and I hear in the room, these men came into the room where I had been sleeping. There were 3 or 4 of them. They were very loud, very obviously drunk, including the voice of the man who had paid me to come to Vegas. And they were fumbling around in the room, and they were just very boisterous. And one of them came out on the balcony and said, well, where did she go? And I wasn't there. And as I sat just huddled in the corner of that balcony, I knew that God, first and foremost, was absolutely real, because there's no way that I would have woken up, and there was no way that I would have gone out onto the balcony and crawled from one balcony to the other if Holy Spirit hadn't compelled me to do that. There is no way. And if I had stayed in that room, there's not a question in my mind that would have gone very badly for me. Very badly. And so I sat out on that balcony until the next morning. My the maids came in to clean that room, and I knocked on the door and they let me in. Sometimes I wonder about those maids, like, what were they thinking? Like, there's this random chick stuck outside on this balcony. And it was like multiple occurrences like that were the only explanation for why I wasn't gang raped, wasn't beat, wasn't, so many things that can go very, very wrong in that industry. Killed. It was because God was looking out for me. That's the only explanation that I have. And so, but I still, even after those two instances, I still stayed in that lifestyle for a couple of years. And what finally did it was I was flat ironing my hair, and I have really long hair and I have a lot of it. So it's a process. So I'm flat ironing my hair. I was living in a house that was given to me by an escorting client. He was a married man. He had an additional house. Me and my children were living in there. He was like my main client at the time. And
so, like, did he give you this house where it's like deeded to you? It's in your name, like you own it, or
no, he owned the house, but I didn't. It was a very big, beautiful house on a golf course. Like I just lived there for free.
Okay.
And I live in Arizona.
Did your kids have any idea what was going on, or anybody else?
No, they thought mommy just worked with DJs. Like,
Okay.
So because this whole time I was still building this other side. I was building this business the whole time. And it was amazing how Satan will allow you to have a cover operation for your sin because that industry was actually a really great cover. That wasn't why I started it, but it was a really great cover because I traveled so much for legitimate reasons that traveling for the escorting reasons wasn't a far fetch. So I was just kind of in this place where my business was almost to the point where I wasn't going to have to escort anymore. But I was kind of mentally, I didn't really know how to not be in that space anymore because the interaction with the men was feeding that manipulation hunger that I had picked up when I was a little kid, and being in control of the sexual encounters because they were paying me made me feel like I was safe. We could have a whole podcast on that all by itself.
Okay. Yeah. So I just want to say this. There is like, I get that. And I get the lies of Satan, and I've been trying not to jump in, but yeah, you absolutely weren't safe because again,
not at all.
You're dealing with I get, there's probably some guys that like, I've never been to a prostitute. I don't know, but I'm guessing that there are some guys who, go to prostitutes or whatever, that they're not predators. They're just, I talked to one guy one time, his first time was with a prostitute because
he's scared or nervous or whatever. Yeah.
And like, I get that, but like so many of those people, they're predators. And it goes back to like what you said, you became an object. You were something that like, they didn't value you, like that poker player coming in with that group of guys. They didn't value you. They weren't valuing you as a person. And then there was alcohol involved, obviously. So, I mean, when alcohol gets involved, bad decisions are there, but there's just, absolutely. There was no safety in that. And it amazes me at how much, like, I'm not amazed that you were deceived, but how much Satan was lying to you, because it started when you were very young. Like, he totally jacked with your mind, and just wow, man. This is hard stuff to hear, and it's really overwhelming, but I think it's something that people definitely need to hear. I think that this is a really important story for people to hear. So,
well, I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to share it, but
it's something people, again, it's just, I think something people need to hear, because there's so many people. Like, one of the things, I'm sorry, I'm interrupting.
No, you're good.
When you were 4, I don't think, and you had kind of said this to me before, when you're 4, when that started happening, you didn't even realize that something, like, you kind of knew something was off, but at the same time, you're like, I guess this is what kids do. That was kind of, you had told me before the show, that was kind of, what you thought. And, I just totally lost my train of thought. Oh my gosh. The older I get, the more that happens. Being in my 40s has been
I know, I'm right there with you.
but yeah.
So I just what ended up happening was I was just kind of in this place at about 4.5 years of escorting where I was just jacked up, like, just being real with you. Like, the stories of things that I have experienced and things that I have seen. Also the heartbreak, because another thing that people don't like to talk about from an escorting perspective is, I would say statistically 85% of the men that would hire me to be escorts, it wasn't even necessarily about sex. It was about not feeling safe at home to express their emotions to their wife. And I was just a very expensive therapist. I mean, I would have men that would see me weekend after weekend after weekend, and they wouldn't touch me. They would want to have conversations about business deals that had gone sideways and financial crises that they were headed toward. And they really needed to be validated as men, but they did not feel safe in their marriage or in the confines of their relationship, because they felt like their wives had become so obsessed with the lifestyle that these super powerful men were providing for them, that they themselves no longer mattered to their wife. And so the complexities of relationship dynamic that I encountered while I was an escort is just mind blowing. And I actually speak at women's conferences to married women about that exact thing, the importance of making sure that you learn how to create safe spaces for your husband to express what he's going through, so that he doesn't seek outside validation. Because now, please, I don't want anyone to, go cancel culture on me and say, oh my God, it's never an excuse to cheat. You're right. There should never be a reason to cheat. That
And
being said, however,
and
we have to.
I do
Go
want
ahead.
to I do want to just throw this in. If even if a man was coming to you and not touching you physically and just coming to you for that, I
It's an
think
emotional affair.
it is
Okay.
an emotional affair, and because it's not. I don't want to sound harsh or mean. It's not the same thing as going to like a therapist. Like
Absolutely not.
I mean,
No,
there's so many levels of difference there,
absolutely.
but yeah,
Absolutely.
when you are not going when now, anyways, that's a whole nother. You need counseling
You need
if
counseling.
if
And
you cannot talk to your spouse, get
yes,
counseling. Tell your
absolutely.
as a man, I'm going to tell you, I've been married 23 years. If I told my wife, hey, we're having a problem, especially with communication, if you
Hmm.
tell your wife of X amount of years, hey, I think we have some communication issues, you can even make it about you and be like, I don't know how to communicate. Let's go to
Hmm.
therapy. For the most part, women are going to be like, okay,
Absolutely. Let's go.
but
Absolutely. So it's just, I think in that space though, the reason I even bring that up is just because where I was at that point after 4.5 years of escorting is, I just had such a warped sense of everything when it came to interactions with men.
yeah,
Everything. And so I was hurting, but because of church hurt that I experienced, and because I didn't trust my parents at this point, um, I didn't, I just didn't trust anybody. I was very much alone. Like, I had a few friends who genuinely, truly knew what I was doing, and everyone else just thought, oh, Ashley's killing it in the music industry game. And they had no idea what was really happening. And so I was in the bathroom flat ironing my hair, and I heard God the only time in my life with my ears, the only time. And he said, I need you to come back to me now, because I have been pursuing you relentlessly for a while. And if you do not come back to me now, I'm going to turn you over to your sin. Now, that is scriptural. I mean,
oh
Matthew,
no,
there's a
it
verse
is.
in Matthew. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
It talks
Like, I
about that
have,
in Romans too, Romans chapter
right.
1.
I think it is Romans. I think it is Romans. Basically, we like to skip over that verse, but what I heard him say was, I have pursued you relentlessly over and over and over. I have demonstrated that I wanted you to be with me over and over and over. I have sent people to deliver messages to you, to tell you how much I want you to be in relationship with me and to pursue your purpose with me, and you are consistently choosing the opposite. Now, I believe that God always leaves the door open for us to come back to him. I genuinely believe that. But I also believe that he is a gentleman and he does not force the issue with us.
Yeah.
So it is 100% our choice. And I was consistently choosing opposite of him. And I think in that
Well,
moment,
I want to just talk about that really, really
yeah,
quick. Okay, so
yeah.
God does always leave the door for us to come back open, or the door for us to come back to him. Just a few quick things the Bible talks about that just address what you're saying.
Hmm.
So when Moses went to get the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, it says several times in Exodus that Pharaoh hardened his heart. Like God proved through crazy, ridiculous, miraculous signs and wonders that he was who he says he was. That thing, he proved that Moses was legit from him, right? And so it says several times Pharaoh hardened his heart, but then it changes and said God hardened Pharaoh's heart. God gave Pharaoh over to what he wanted. And in not Hebrews, in Romans, it talks about how people who intentionally, willfully, basically reject God, because God's revealed himself to everybody, but God will give people over to a reprobate mind, a mind that doesn't work. He'll give them over to the choice to choose sin instead of him. So Romans chapter 1, you can look it up and read it for yourself. So what you're saying is absolutely like based on scripture, or not
Right.
it's came from God, but it's
Yeah.
the scriptural basis for it as well, for God,
Right.
that kind of thing. So
Right. So I'm like flat ironing my hair, I'm like, oh, that is not what I want. Like, I know, based on the growing up in church and because of things that I had seen, like I've told you other stories of things that I witnessed firsthand of God when I was young, and like knowing who he was, I was like, I know I don't want that.
yeah,
Like, I may not know a lot, but I know I do not want that.
yeah.
So I literally, that I hadn't been inside of a church in years, probably 10. And I Googled women's Bible studies that day. It was a Wednesday morning. And the one closest to my house I went to was 10 a.m. At Living Word Ahwatukee in Ahwatukee, Arizona. And I walked through those church doors and I just started to bawl. I mean, like ugly snot tears the minute I stepped into that church. And it was a whole bunch of older women, which is funny because they're probably like, who's this hot mess that just walked in here, because she is like blubbering and carrying on. And I sat down, and the woman who spoke that day was teaching on no condemnation in Christ. Yeah.
Romans
Yeah.
1.
Like straight. And so I rededicated my life to the Lord that day. The woman who prayed with me to rededicate my life, her name is Donna Foster. She is my spiritual mom. She has been rocking with me ever since. And that day I just quit cold turkey escorting. Like that was it. I went home and called the man whose house I was living in, and I was stoked, like I gave my life to Jesus. And he's like, you can get out of my house. Like, and I was just like, crap, because my kids live with me. And the funny part is that I was at the point where my legit business was making money. I was like, well, it's going to be fine because I have this other income. I got an apartment, moved my kids out, and what I felt in my spirit was, Ashley, you cannot keep this business because you built it on the back of dirty money. I want you to sell it, and I want you to donate the money.
What?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's amazing when God tells you stuff like that, and you're just like, how in that? Like, I'm not trying to point out my story, but like, God told me years ago to start fixing cars for broke people for free as my full-time job and never ask for money. And I was like, what? I'm like, wife, kids, bills. I'm
exactly. I'm like, I have two
how
little
does this
kids,
work?
God. Yeah, exactly. Like, I don't know. It's those conversations you have with God where you're like, I don't know if you know, but I've got people that I have to feed, and of course he knows. Of course he knows.
Yeah.
But so that's what I did. I sold my business to a larger agency in LA and donated my money to the people to an organization that helps human trafficking victims. And never looked back. I mean, it was literally. Now, to say that I never considered going back is a lie, because there were some moments during that first year or so after escorting that I really struggled, because it's easy money. Like, I'm not going to sit here in front. Like, it's super easy money. You making six figures, not working essentially, and sleeping in swanky hotel rooms. But God was just so totally faithful. And, as I started going through therapy with some amazing faith-based therapists, like legit therapists, I'm a huge proponent of that. Find a legit trained psychotherapist who also loves Jesus, because they do exist.
Let's specify, they need to have a degree from an actual university.
Absolutely.
It can be a Christian university, but they need an actual degree that's recognized by the state, and they need to be
Right.
licensed by the
yes.
state. Because like I do counseling with people on like TikTok and stuff. People ask me
Right.
questions, and and that's fine. But to really, like, when you start really diving into people's like issues and backgrounds, yeah, you want somebody legit. And
Absolutely.
and granted, the Bible says that Jesus is the wonderful counselor, or the great physician and the wonderful counselor, and the Holy Spirit can give us all the wisdom and knowledge and everything we need to be able to counsel somebody. But I look at the standard in America. If that's where their gifting is, they need to be trained and educated, and that way it's just legit on the up and up. And
absolutely.
Yeah.
So I started going through therapy, and I thought, whenever I started, I was like, oh, we're just gonna talk about how I was an escort, we're gonna deal with that, and I'm gonna be good. No.
Yeah, you had to go
we had to go way back and really start delving into all of these things that I've explained to people. But as I went through that process, my spiritual mom, Donna, who has been and still is, she was praying with me on the phone this morning, has really walked me through this journey, because that happened, it was 9 years ago this past September that I rededicated my life to the Lord. So it's been 9 years. The journey that I have been through to get to the point where I am now, she told me probably 3 years in, she's like, Ashley, I genuinely believe that God is going to use your story to transform the lives of women. And I told her straight up, I said, if you think I'm going to stand on a stage and tell people I used to be a hooker, you've lost your mind. Like, I'm not doing that. I'm just straight up not doing that. But the crazy thing is that, I tell people God is it's on my TikTok a lot too. Like, God is in the beauty from ashes business. He takes a mess and turns it into a message 100%, if you allow him to step in and to genuinely pick up all the broken pieces, and you don't hide any elements from him.
I think I'm sorry, I want to jump in real quick.
Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I think is the most important or is something just so important for us to understand, and I don't think a lot of people realize, is the freedom that we have to be honest with God, because we think okay, so one of my favorite stories, I tell this story all the time. I think it's in every episode of the podcast. I've probably told this story, but I think it's so important for people to understand. We don't have a choice about being transparent with God, because he sees everything. There was this story in Genesis where Abraham and Sarah, it's like a year before they're going to have their son Isaac. God shows up with 2 angels in tow. Sarah's in the tent, and God tells Abraham, a year from now, y'all are going to have a son. Sarah's in the tent and she hears it. She doesn't say anything. She doesn't verbalize anything. It says that in her heart, she laughed and doubted, and God called her out on it. He said, why did you laugh? And she's like, I didn't laugh. Now, technically, she didn't laugh out loud, but she did. And they had this argument about it. But the reality was, God knows every thought. He knows everything that goes on. And there's nothing we can hide from God. And for me, that's been really freeing and liberating to understand that, because I can be completely honest with God. I don't have to hide anything, because I can't. And when I try to, he's like, really? You're kind of acting like a fool right now. It's like Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Like, when God showed up, hey, where are y'all? Like, he didn't ask because he didn't know. He was giving them the opportunity to fess up,
right?
He knew everything that transpired,
right?
And so we have this incredible freeing ability to be honest with God. And when we're honest, it really does. There is something freeing in it. There's something liberating. I was talking to a guy yesterday, and he's, his big thing that he talked about, he struggled with porn for years and years and years. And he felt constantly dirty, guilty, and ashamed, wanted to get over it. And it wasn't until he was honest with it or honest about it with one of, some people that he trusted, and with God. But him being honest, he said as soon as he told somebody, that
Hmm.
dirtiness and that guiltiness, just he felt like it
Hmm.
went away. He didn't feel dirty
Yeah.
anymore, and he wasn't alone in it. So
Yeah. Well, my favorite story in the Bible, hands down, is Rahab. I mean, one, because she's a hooker, so I've got a soft spot for her anyway. But to your point, whenever you read that story, it very clearly states that in order for her and her entire family to be saved, she had to hang her red cord out the window. And, you'll get theologians that want to be real deep that said, oh, it represents the blood of Jesus, maybe. But historically, if you understand the connotation of what that red cord was, it let people know she was a hooker. She would hang that cord over her door in the hallways to identify her home as a place where men could go to have sex. And so, in order for her to be saved, she had to own exactly who she was. She couldn't
wow.
hide it. She couldn't hide it. She literally had to hang it out the window. And there's two parts when I preach it with this particular passage of scripture, she had to hang the cord out the window because that's what brought salvation to her and her family. But it also identified to her redeemers, which were the nation of Israel, that that's who they were supposed to save. If she had hidden who she was, the redeemers, the nation of Israel, would not have been able to save her. And the symbolism of that is so incredibly powerful to me, because if she had been like, I don't want to hang this red cord out the window because I don't want people to know what I'm struggling with. I don't want people to know who I am. I don't want people to know all of the things that I have done. Her whole family, Jesus argued, like, Jesus would have still been here because God is God, but like, she's in the lineage of Christ. Her whole family would have come to a stop. So it redeemed her bloodline, but in addition to that, it allowed her redeemers, the people who came to free her, to keep her from being destroyed in Jericho. Owning who she was is what brought her salvation.
Wow. And you don't have
Yeah.
to, when you're trying to get past sin and stuff, you don't have to like you don't have
No,
to
you don't need to
put out
hire
to
create a
everybody.
billboard. No, no,
You
no,
don't have
no.
to go out and say, hey,
No.
look, here's my sin. I was, XYZ for the
Right.
past,
In
X
fact,
years.
I would say don't do that.
Yeah.
But to own your mess in front of your redeemer,
Yeah. Well,
to be
that's
able to go to your redeemer, is a really important thing.
one of the things that the Bible tells us that we have to have in our life in order to get saved is repentance. And a lot of people say, well, repenting means you turn from your sin. Well, first of all, the word repent in English and the Greek word it comes from doesn't mean that you change your actions. It means you have a change of mind. And quite literally, like the Bible repeatedly tells us, we don't have the ability on our own to change
Mm-hmm.
our actions, to change who we are. You can change it for a while, but you're always going to go back because you're a slave to sin. But to repent means you have a change of mind. It's like the thief on the cross next to Jesus. Early in the day, both the guys were mocking Jesus, but then one of them looked at the other one and said, you know what? We're guilty. We're getting what we deserve. This Jesus guy's.
Right.
And so there has to be a point where you change your mind about the condition of your
Mm-hmm.
life. You have to come to a point where you say, you know what? I am a sinner in need of a savior. And
Mm-hmm.
God, here it is. Here it is in all its horrible glory. Here's my sin. Here's who I am. And until you can be honest with God about it, you can't get healing from it, because it's like
Absolutely.
if you have a giant lump growing off your face, until you actually recognize, hey, I have a lump and I need to go see a doctor, you're
Mm-hmm.
not going to get better. So
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So to say, obviously, that transition period for me was pretty immediate. And for other people, it's a longer process. But now what's amazing is speaking to what you said about how Satan, kept targeting the same thing over and over and over. I think the reason that he wanted to destroy that element is because, like, now the women that I work with predominantly are like strippers and human trafficking victims and present and former prostitutes and women who have used sex to manipulate men just in their homes. And it's so like my ministry is so tied to those people
Wow.
that I'll do strip club ministry where I go and I take the girls dinner and I just sit back there in the dressing room with them and I listen to their stories and I talk about their kids and I pray with them. And I've had so many strippers say, well, God doesn't want to have a relationship with me. And I'm like, no, he does want to have a relationship with you. Like I was a prostitute and he came after me and he has a relationship with me, and there's literally nothing that you could do or are doing with any of these men that disqualifies you from the love of God. And if I were just a woman who had never experienced any of those things, the influence that I would have in these very dark places would not be what it is now. And so it's not a testament of, like, I don't believe that God made me go through all of those things so that I could minister to those people. But I do believe 100% that whenever you hand the broken pieces over to God, he's able to, speak life over a field of dry bones and bring it to life again.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, there's a huge chasm between God making us go through something, which there's times God does cause us to go
absolutely.
through. There's a huge difference between God making us go through something and God letting us go through something. Those are not the
The
same.
same. Right.
Those are very, very different. And one of the things, and I think this right now hits on a huge question that so many people have. If there is a good, loving God, how could a loving God let a 4-year-old go through that and then your life lead to that? And now I'll say one of the things, like, as I'm listening to your story, and there's other stuff that happened that we didn't even get into.
Hmm.
There was some miraculous things. You saw an eyeball grow back at
Hmm.
one point, in the midst of all this craziness. God in his grace was never done with you. And God
Right.
kept saying, I mean, you didn't just accidentally fall down this rabbit hole. I mean, you kind of did, but you made choices. I mean,
Absolutely.
we make choices. You were warped and I mean, not warped as a person, but like your ability to reason had been damaged,
Hmm.
to think through some of this stuff, I think had been hurt, but you still made choices. And in the
Hmm.
midst of all of that, there's still this thread of God's grace where he keeps calling you, and you finally gave over to it. But then it gets into that question of, if there's a good loving God, how could he allow this stuff to happen? Well, one, because I'll say this, and then I want to hear what you have to say, because I think
Hmm.
I haven't heard you answer this, but I'm guessing you can. I'm guessing you've thought about this. This is probably
Hmm.
something you've thought about, but I forgot what I was going to say again. Oh my gosh. I got to see a doctor or something. There's something wrong with me. I'll be saying something. I forget where I'm going with it, but yeah, but no, I'd love to hear kind of but no, I had it and then I lost it again. I'm gonna have to go back and edit that, because, oh gosh, I'm such a dork. But yeah, anyways, but no. So what are your thoughts on that? Like, why does God allow like this stuff to happen? Oh, I remember. Okay, so I'm sorry. I'm gonna say it because before I
Yeah, go ahead.
so there's, I think, specific reasons in different situations, but like one of the things I think is important to understand is that we are in a broken, fallen world that's in rebellion against God. Like, one of the things that God promised the Israelites in the Levitical law was that if they would follow him according to the Levitical law, nobody would ever have a miscarriage in the nation of Israel. Like, he made
Right.
some crazy, amazing promises, and they
Hmm.
went, we're going to do things our own way. As
Right.
the human race, we are like a teenage child that ran away from home, burned the house down, are running off, screaming, cursing our parents out. We set the car on fire as we're leaving. Our life is falling apart because as a teenager, you can't really take care of yourself,
Hmm.
and then we're looking back at our parent going, why aren't you
It's
taking
all your
care of me,
fault.
fixing my
Right.
job? This is all your fault, when really you're rejecting this good, loving God, so as a species, we have rejected God, and he's going, I want to help you. I want to fix your problems, but y'all are keeping me out. So
Hmm.
that's one thing, but let's get more into specific things, because I mean, do you ever wonder, like, why did God let that happen to me, and look at your life now and go, okay, I can see how maybe I don't understand exactly why, but what he's doing with it and the way he's redeemed.
Yeah. Yeah, even on TikTok, you'll get people, I'm sure you get people too, that some pretty angry people that are like, well, why would God protect a hooker whenever, but allow kids, to be molested by pedophiles, la la. And I think the first thing that I always say is that while all powerful, God is not a puppet master. And the reason is because he wants our relationship with him to be our choice. And if he controlled any element of humanity, then our relationship with him would be fictitious because he would have control of it. And so I don't believe that. I think when God looks at humanity and looks at our fallen ways, that wasn't what he intended whenever he created mankind. That isn't what his perfect will is for humanity is. But back to what I said before, he's a gentleman. He's not going to force us to do anything. When sin entered the world, it's not God hurting people, it's a consequence of sin, essentially. And something as a women's pastor and with the church that we have planted, something that I try really hard to just be very transparent about, and some people may think that I'm crazy for this. There's some things, like, if I'm going to be real with you, Chris, I don't know. Like let's be real. I don't know. I wish that I had that answer, but I can't 100% speak to why God allows 4-year-olds to be molested by older children. I don't know 100, like, that's just being real. What I do know.
So thank you very much for the honesty in that. Because as Christians, a lot of times I think sometimes we feel like we have to be able to answer everything. And I want to. I'm so guilty of wanting to be able to answer everything. And there's one thing that I know is that God has proven he's true enough. And he's proven himself faithful in my life over and over and over again. And I'm not talking about like wishful thinking. I mean, like, he's proven that he's true and that he's real. And so there are things that I don't understand, that I can't wrap my head around. I'll be honest. So there's a verse that specifically about this that I struggle with. I've never got it. I don't think I ever will. I'm going to ask God about it in heaven one day, but it's there. And I'm guessing that my understanding of what it's saying probably isn't right. It's Ephesians 5:20. Okay. So there's a verse where it says, give thanks always in all things, but Ephesians 5:20 says, give thanks always for all things. Like, it's really specific the way it says it in English. And I'm just like, I don't get that. And I don't know how to wrap my head around that. I'm like, in your situation, I don't know how to tell a 4-year-old, be thankful for that. I'm like, I believe 100% of the Bible, but I also believe I don't always understand everything that it says perfectly. And that's one of those things. I'm like, I don't know what to do with Ephesians 5:20. I mean, full disclosure, I just don't know. Yeah. I've asked pastors and counselors and all kinds of people. I've heard all kinds of different answers. I've never got one that I feel like this is what God was saying. But I do know that I think I'm understanding something wrong. And I don't think God is telling me I need to tell a 4-year-old that happened to, that she needs to be thankful for what happened to her.
Right.
So,
right. I think I have a pastor mentor, friend, who he has said that he thinks one of the biggest mistakes that the church makes whenever we are talking about God, specifically to non-believers, is to talk about the elements of God that we don't understand instead of focusing on the things about God that we absolutely know from experience.
Wow.
And so that has really shaped how I handle questions like that. Like, it's always, my response is always, well, God did not create robots and there are consequences for sin. And I can't tell you why. I can't explain because I legitimately don't know. But what I do know is that my God woke me up in the middle of the night and had me climb onto a different balcony so I wasn't gang raped. I know that. What I do know is that there was a man on an airplane who, despite how uncomfortable he was, reminded me how much God loves me and that I had a greater purpose for my life than the life that I was living. I know that. I know that because of the things that I have been through, all of it, I am able to walk into very dark places and be a light in a way that I would never be able to be if I hadn't lived through the things that I had lived through. I know that because of the church hurt that I experienced that sent me down that path, that God has given me insight and the ability to create a ministry that reaches people who have been hurt deeply by the church and touch them and help with their healing that I would not have been able to do or to organize if I hadn't experienced the church hurt. And so
Yeah.
for me, it's really more about doing exactly what my mentor said and own the things that I don't know
Yeah.
and just testify to the things that I have experienced that I know for sure.
Well, and one thing that I hold on to, like there's one thing that I hold on to, and you really just hit it when we talk about why God allows suffering. Like I don't have every answer for it. And I look at the Bible and what it says and I try and kind of, wrap my head around it, but there's people that you can minister to that I can't. There's women that just, I mean, based on the fact that like I'm a man, like will not listen to me, it's the way that it is. But there's people who, because of where you're at now, where God has got you to through his grace to continually pull you out of the place you didn't want to come out of, because that happened, because of what God did in your life, there are people who are destined for eternal separation from God in a lake of fire in hell for all eternity. That's where they're headed. But because of the way that God has redeemed you, their eternal destiny has changed. There are people that were going to go to hell, but because of the person that you are now and what God has done in your life, they're on their way to heaven. There's a passage in 1 Corinthians 4 where it talks about how Paul wrote, he said, 1 Corinthians 4 I love because it talks a lot about suffering. And Paul kind of says, okay, so here's some of the reason, like how God uses our suffering that we've gone through. But one of the things he says in 1 Corinthians 4, he says, we're always delivered to death for your sake. And he goes on and he talks about how even though I've been delivered to death, it's bringing you out of death and into life. And so I take like your story and I take the things that I've been through and I'm like, if I had the choice, there are things in my life that I would change. My brother and cousin, and this is like my brother and cousin were playing with a handgun when my brother was 11 and my cousin was 10, and my cousin died coming out of that. My brother's never been okay. He's never been the same. If I could change that, I absolutely would. But I think because of some things that have happened, there's people that were going to spend eternity in hell that are now going to spend eternity in heaven. And it's hard to look at a situation like that and go, well, that makes it worth it. But because we're so focused on this life, but I hold on.
Well, have you heard, you know who Francis Chan is, I'm assuming?
I love Francis.
I love Francis Chan. But his sermon, and people listen to this podcast, I can highly encourage you to go track it down. The sermon where he has the rope and there's this much of the rope is painted red, and then the rest of the rope, there's just rope and rope and rope. And he's like, the problem with Christians is we focus on this much rope, which represents our life, completely ignoring, I mean, it's like hundreds of feet of rope, which represents eternity. And I think for me, like I have people ask me in interviews frequently, like, well, do you regret anything that you've done? Or do you wish any of that had not happened to you? And as cliche as it may sound, no, like I would live through all of it, every single moment of it again, because there's a TikTok trend right now that's the voice of Bane that says, You adapted to the dark. I was born in it.
Yeah.
And the truth is that somebody who was born again in the dark, like I was, has the ability to navigate the dark differently.
Yeah.
Than someone who hasn't experienced that. And, you know, if you're a believer and you got saved when you were young and you didn't have anything quote unquote bad happen to you, there's beauty, there's amazing beauty in that too.
Oh my gosh. Yes.
But for me, I'm thankful truly that I can navigate the dark because I was born again in the dark.
Wow. Man, that's heavy. That's really, really heavy. This has been this whole episode has just been heavy, you know, and it's hard to hear those things. The reality is though, you know, when I look at crowds of people now, I look at it different. You know, I look at a crowd of people and I'm like, you know, and just not going to go into all the stuff with my life, but you know, like if I'm looking at a crowd of people, so often I'll think a high percentage of these people, a large number, 1 out of 3 of these girls has been sexually abused at some point. 1 out of 5 of these boys has been sexually abused at some point. And most people probably don't even know that's happened to them.
Mm-hmm.
So many of, you know, the things that they do, you know, because it affects our behavior, it affects the way we act, you know, and it's something that's not talked about. It's something that there's so much shame in, you know, if you know, I got a buddy of mine right now and you know, he's got you know, some health issues and stuff, and he's trying to, you know, raise money and stuff on TikTok. And I'm like, we can talk about that. Your wife just died from cancer. Talk about it. You know, let's talk about it. Let's bring you comfort. You know, you've got you know, whatever's going on in our lives, we talk about those things. We look for support from people. But when we get into things where it relates to sexual abuse, sexual trauma, domestic violence, we close ourselves off from everybody else because there's this shame that's attached to it. We don't want people to know. And so I mean, if you're in any kind of, I've got to say, if you're in any kind of situation where something is happening to you and it just doesn't like feel right, if somebody, some man or woman, the way that they hug you or touch you or look at you or the things they say to you makes you uncomfortable, listen to your gut, listen to your stomach, listen to your instinct. Don't blow it off. Don't just say, well, you know what? It's just the way this person is. Maybe the way this person is really dangerous and you just don't know it. You know, maybe he's done the same thing to 12 other kids and you just don't know what he's done. So listen to your gut, always listen to your gut. And also if something actually is happening to you, please get help. Please find somebody you trust. And one of the things that breaks my heart, and this is a reality, the first person you tell may not believe you. It might be somebody who you trust. You might talk to your mom and she may not believe you, or like what your parents did. And I'm not trying to bash on your parents. We're not going to do anything. I had a friend in this friend in high school, and I didn't know what to do with this because I was young at the time, but I was a freshman in high school, and there was a guy that you know, rode the same bus as me. And at one point, he told me that his mother's live-in boyfriend had started sexually abusing him when he was very young. And he told his mom, and she was like, "Deal with it or get out." Like, and I mean, I hear things like that, and it crushes me, you know. And you know, he lost, you know, had no trust. He didn't know who to talk to, and he didn't talk to anybody. But if something like that is going on, find somebody that will listen to you and get help. Because it doesn't have to be like that. It is not your fault. It is when something like that, when that nasty dude that was older than you said, "Hey, you know, you were teasing me for however many years," that's disgusting. And predators say things like that. They work hard to put the blame on you. They want They, like, I heard one girl one time, she had been told, well, dirty things happen to dirty kids. And so,
Right.
and from when she was not much older than you were when you started getting abused.
Mhm.
And so she became convinced that it's what she deserved.
Right.
There is
So that lie. Yeah.
that lie. Yes, there is nobody who deserves that happening to you. If something like that is happening to you, you do not deserve it. You didn't earn anything to happen to it. What you wear does not give anybody the right to do anything to you. If
No,
anything is
absolutely.
happening to you, I'm going to post some numbers in the description for this video for
Yeah.
like sex abuse helplines, domestic abuse. There's going to be numbers in here, suicide helplines. I'm putting help numbers in the description of this video. If you are in any kind of danger or an unsafe situation, please find the numbers in the description, get help. You can Google it, but you do not have to live like that. You may,
No.
when you get out of the situation that you're in, you may not get into a perfect situation. It may not even be a great situation, but it should be a better situation
Better.
you're in,
Right.
because there are people who you don't even know that will fight for you. There are
Absolutely.
people like Ashley who, she wouldn't even know you, but if you got in touch with her and was like, here's what's going on, she would fight for you. If you got in touch with me and said, here's what's going on, I would fight for you as hard as I could to make sure that you got out of that situation. There are people that don't know you, that care about you. There is a God who loves you, that doesn't want you to be in that situation. He doesn't want you to go through that. He didn't create you to experience that. He wants you to have a good, happy, healthy life that's not filled with abuse and trauma. And if you did go through it, and I want to get into your healing some, because we haven't really, I know we've hinted around or something. We haven't really got into how much healing God has brought you, but I do want you to know there is good healing. God absolutely can heal us and completely restore us from any and all trauma in the past. And I want to kind of hear from you about how God has healed you and brought restoration in your life.
All right. Yeah. So obviously, whenever you've gone through that much trauma, I think whenever it comes to healing, the first and most important thing is just being very intentional about it. I think a lot of times, whether we go through something major, like stuff that I've been through, or things that people would deem quote unquote as less traumatic, although who's to determine what trauma is?
I just want to say, I'm sorry.
Oh, it's
I
okay.
keep jumping in. I think one thing that's important for people to understand is things like trauma and grief. You cannot compare yours to somebody else, because
Absolutely, yes.
it is, when we hear about, we all go through stuff. We all have some level of trauma and grief in our life, right? It's there for everyone. But sometimes we hear stories like yours and you're like, oh my gosh, what I went through isn't that bad. But the reality is, we were not created to experience this stuff. God created us to experience perfection, and the pain and the grief and the things that we experience is our response to experiencing something we're not supposed to. And so what you're dealing with, whatever your grief, whatever it is you're going through, it's valid and it's real. And even if you go through the exact same thing as somebody else, you're not going to go through it exactly the same. So
agreed, 100%.
never minimalize or marginalize what you've been through just because what somebody else went through sounds much more radical and terrible.
Yeah. Also, I think to that point, I think whenever it comes to healing, also taking into consideration personalities is really important, because there are certain personalities that just process through things linearly. There are people that process through things through more like a spider web. They just go from point to point to point to point to point to point, and they've got to go through all of that to heal. There are people who are very emotional processors. There's people like me who I'm a very logical processor. I mean, I'm professionally a data analyst. And so I want to know the science and the data behind what my mind is doing in order to accomplish healing. So, for some people, having very emotional therapists that really talk about how you're feeling is the way to go. For me, I'm like, this isn't helping me. Like, I want to know the science, And so, taking the time to figure out what method works for you from a psychological and therapist perspective is important. For me, I went through multiple therapists before I found one that really, really was able to work with me on the level that I needed to be worked with. And so taking the time and understanding that you may see a therapist 3 or 4 times, get some good stuff from them and realize like this one isn't really the best fit. So I need to find a different one. Don't be afraid to advocate for yourself in therapy.
Yeah. And I had brought up before the importance of, going to school and having the degree and everything, but that doesn't mean that somebody is good at what they're doing. Just because somebody
Correct.
goes to school and gets the degree, they can pass with, flying colors, straight A's, and they might suck as a counselor. I was going to a counselor for a while, and he had like no trauma in his life. He'd never been through anything, and he couldn't relate to what I was going through. And so he ended up giving me really bad advice that was the opposite of what I needed. And I never went back. And I kept trying to explain, look, this is why, I can't do what you're saying. He just didn't want to listen, and he just had no empathy. So it's really important, to find somebody who, is a Christian and is filled with the Holy Spirit. I believe that.
I agree.
If you're not a Christian though, if you're going, hey, Jesus ain't for me, and you're listening to this, still find counseling. I think that helps the Jesus part, but find somebody that works for you, because I have gone through many counselors, and finding one that worked for me, it took a minute, but I finally found, you've got to find someone who can relate to you and connect with you and help you.
Absolutely. And then also, so I was with the same therapist for a really long time. And after a certain period of time, probably about 6-7 months ago, actually, she said, Ashley, I feel like we have done all the work that we can do. I think that the area that you're really struggling with now is PTSD from this particular season of your life. And I want you to start seeing this therapist that specializes in PTSD for that thing. So also finding therapists that are willing to say, you know what, I know a ton about childhood sexual trauma, but once I feel like we have walked through that as much as I can, and we still see that you're really struggling with addiction or whatever over here, I advise that you go see a specialist that deals with addiction, like making sure that you find therapists that do that. From a spiritual perspective, man, I cannot say enough for the importance of looking at the situations that you have had in your life and figuring out what those lies are, the lies that I've talked about multiple times. Because if the only thing you're addressing is the symptom of the lie, the pattern that you find yourself in is going to continue to come up over and over and over. And so for me, a very tangible thing that I did was I started asking God during this season of my life, please reveal to me what lie I believed so that I can uproot the lie. And I would carry around a little notebook, and it would be amazing how random things would pop into my head, like, oh, that's a lie. That's a lie that I believe about myself that it isn't of God. And I would write that thing down. And then what I would do is go and find scripture to reprogram my brain and just speak the truth over myself. So that's important. That piece is so important, because you can tell yourself this isn't the truth. And that's important too. Like for me, I believe that words have power. Sometimes we have to hear ourselves say things to switch our brain. So the lie that sex is a tool that you use to manipulate men to get what you want, that is a lie. So what I had to do when I recognized it is say, the belief that sex is a tool that I can use to manipulate men is a lie. That is not the truth. The truth is that I am a temple, and I have lists of scriptures
Right.
that I would literally speak out loud over myself on a daily basis, because we renew our minds with the washing of the word. Like, you have to literally scrub your mind with truth. And the way to do that is to get into the word and combat whatever lies come up as you pray and ask God to reveal what you've believed and counter it with the word of God.
And
Yeah.
Jesus actually talked about exactly what you're talking about in John 8:31 and 32. And a lot of people know this passage, but Jesus said, abide in my word and you'll be my disciples indeed, and you'll know the truth and the truth will set you free. And here's the thing that's important about what he said. He said, when he said you'll know the truth, the word that's, because this came from Greek, this was originally written in Greek, but that word doesn't just mean to like, okay, like I have this knowledge in my head, but it means that it's something that you know through experience. It's something that you've put into practice where you've taken the truth and not just say, okay, I have this truth as this shiny pearl in my hand, but you've actually taken it and used it and applied it to your life. And it's not enough to just read something in the Bible and go, yep, okay. You've got, like, what you're saying is such a great, like, perfect illustration of what it looks like to know the truth through experience, by actually saying it, by realizing this is what the lie is. Because if you want freedom, you've got to know the truth. Jesus is the truth, but you've got to know the truth that he says through his word. You've got to realize what the lies that Satan's trying to pitch to you are, and then look at God's word and say, what does it say about me? Who does God say that I am? And once you start doing that, like I've done the same thing in my life for years. And when I start looking at God's word and go, this is what it says. There is no condemnation because I'm in Christ. No, I'm not separated from God. I mean, so yeah, what you're saying.
And making Joyce Meyer Ministries actually has a really powerful, I'll try to find the link and send it to you. So if you want to put it in the bio of this, you can, but she literally has like a list of scriptures about who God says you are. And it's probably the most comprehensive list that I've seen. I had found most of them on my own just through study, but you know, there are things I pray over my children, like, you know, you are the head and not the tail. You are more than a conqueror. You are a mighty man of valor. You are surrounded. The favor of the Lord surrounds you like a shield. I mean, like these things,
right?
But it has to be a practice. And the key part really for me was looking at the areas of my life that I knew were traumatic, great traumas or small traumas, and saying, God, what lie did I swallow that has become part of my psyche that now lends itself to how I operate in my day-to-day that needs to be uprooted here? And he'll show you. Like, he wants you to be free. That's the thing. He doesn't want you to live in bondage. He doesn't want you to live in these cyclical, toxic patterns. He wants you to be free. So if you ask him to reveal those things to you, and sometimes the lies are small, like sometimes it's little bitty things that you think, that's not a big deal, that have taken such a deep root in your spirit that now, you know, you're not able to function. You're just repeating toxic patterns. So that's one thing that I would definitely say from a healing perspective. Another thing is community, man.
Well, one thing I'm sorry, before you move on.
No, you're good.
I want to touch on one thing that's really important there is, you know, when you like, even from a secular non-Christian perspective, you know, I think people will hit on, okay, you've got to recognize like the lies in your life. But the one thing that God brings us, you know, there was truth that you were speaking that you had identified where you had believed a lie, specific things you said, like about you being a temple. We get that from God's word. That's not something that the world is going to teach. So there's truth that God gives us that we need to get from him in order to be free, because the counseling and things like that, apart from God, that can help. But I really genuinely believe that apart from God, you can never completely heal. You can never be completely transformed from where you were. You can find some healing, but God is going to bring us the greatest and best and complete healing. And so what I want to do is, you know, talk about the other ways where you found healing, but I definitely want to get into what God did in you, not just like through this journey, but like, because I know there's some supernatural things that he did in you where there's nothing you could have done on your own to get some of the healing that you've got. It wasn't method. It wasn't, you know, because we're talking about community and there's things even, you know, that where it brings healing. But I don't want to get there just yet. I want to go through community and the other things, and then I want to get into where this was God and nothing else. And yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I would say making sure that you have people in your life that consistently remind you who you are now. And sometimes that means getting rid of people who constantly remind you of who you were then. And sometimes those people are difficult to quiet. But it is impossible, in my opinion, to truly heal if you continuously have your inner circle of friends being like, well, that's not who you are. You used to do this, this, and this. If my friends were constantly reminding me that I was a hooker, it'd be very difficult to stop being a hooker. And so finding people who understand who you are striving to become and who God is turning you into, and making sure that those people are on your, speed dial, so that in the moments when you're like, man, I really feel like I want to go back to that, or I'm really struggling with these thoughts, or these are the lies that I keep, I just can't seem to get rid of them. Having those people who come alongside you and remind you, like, that's not who you are. Like, this is who you are now. This is where you're going. This is what you need to do in order to, and having a couple of those people that are close to you that have the authority and the spiritual maturity to be able to walk with you through that season. My spiritual mom, Donna, I tell people all the time, if it were not for that woman, there's no way I would be where I am right now. And she's a gift from God. God sent her to me, and I am thankful. She's in her 70s, and she has full permission to be all up in my business,
So, and this is a woman that when you walked into that church blubbering that you met, how long ago was that? When was that actually happened?
That happened 9 years ago, the
Okay.
second week of September, this past September.
So this woman, you walk into this church, an absolute complete train wreck.
Mm-hmm.
You walk in and just start ugly crying, like horrible, ugly crying. You just watched some terrible romantic movie that just ripped your heart out. And mixed with Old Yeller and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And they're just like losing it. And this woman, Donna, comes up to you, and she's been with you ever since.
Ever since. Mm-hmm.
Love it.
Yeah,
Wow.
she'll be listening to this, I'm sure. She's like my
Awesome.
biggest cheerleader. Short of my own mother, my real mom. But yeah, as far as God though, like my interactions with God, I'm going to be real transparent. There have been moments where I have cursed at God, screamed at God, cried at God, questioned God, told God that I didn't want to have anything to do with him anymore because how could he allow such and such to happen to me? And one thing that I can say has just radically changed. I mean, there's so many things, but for instance, there was a season in my life where I couldn't even allow my children to touch my face.
Wow.
Because of what had happened when I was raped. He cracked my cheekbone and my jawbone. And I mean, even my children, when they're like 2-3 years old, if they went to touch my face, it was like an automatic. And finally,
Wow.
I just went to God and I was like, I don't like that my children can't touch my face. I don't like that my automatic response when someone tries to demonstrate kindness to me through touch is to flinch and to be scared. And I need you to remove this from me. And it sounds like such a little thing, but I just cried and I said, God, I want my children to be able to be that close to me. I don't want them to ever think that I'm pulling away from them and caught my pain to cause them pain because I'm flinching when they go to touch me. And I just felt like this overwhelming peace after I prayed that prayer. And now my 3-year-old's always all up in my face and he's just holding my face and like, Mommy, you're so beautiful. And he's, stroking my face. And I kind of makes me emotional because every time my 3-year-old touches my face and he's just like, Mom, you're just so pretty. I feel like it's God talking to me through him. That no matter how much you've gone through and all of the things that you've had happen to you, including the season of your life where you couldn't even allow someone to touch your face, like that's been healed, and I'm going to use this super precious little human to communicate to you how beautiful that I think that you are. That's just one. Another one is one time when I was just railing at God. I think people sometimes would be scandalized by how this women's pastor talks to God, because I just have very real conversations with him. And I was just going at it in my Bible. This is my Bible. I've had it forever, and it's like falling apart. And I never really spent much time in Job, because Job's just kind of a downer of a book, like this dude like living his life, like, and then God takes everything from him. And I was like, screw you, God, I'm just done. Like, I know you saved me, and I know that I'm healing, but I'm just angry at you. And I don't even think that you know what I go through. This is what I told God. Like, I don't even think that you know. Like, you're supposed to be all knowing, but you don't know how I feel. You don't know. And I literally threw my Bible. I just chunked it, and it fell open to Job 38. And I don't know, I'll read you just a little bit of what Job 38 says. Basically, this Bible is so old, like the pages stick together.
I have had to sew the binding in my Bible back together. It is taped together and glued together. I have repaired it multiple.
Well, you'll probably understand this then. I have multiple Bibles, okay? Like, obviously I have multiple copies, multiple versions. But I even did a TikTok a couple of weeks ago that talked about how if I pick up a Bible other than this Bible, I can't find Proverbs. Yeah, see, you get
This
it.
is just on my desk. This is my little baby.
Yeah, yeah,
This is
yeah.
my because I'm old and going blind. I'm not really old. I'm getting older. My large print, and then
Right.
this one is my reader's Bible. This one's actually kind of cool. It has no chapters or verses or
Cool.
anything
Yeah.
yet. But
well, it just makes me laugh, because I'm like, all of a sudden Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John have gone on vacation. I can't find them in another Bible. It's so silly. It's the same book, but this Bible is like my go-to. But I'll just read a little bit.
I can look at the color from the stain on the front spine part where the pages are and tell you where a book is. The other side, not the spine, but the part where you thumb through.
Yeah, you get it. You completely get it. So I just threw this Bible on the bed, and it opened to Job 38. And Job 38 says, for context, 37, Job is like freaking out on God. Like, like,
why?
Yeah. So in 38, it says, it's so funny. It says, then the Lord answered Job, like, like, I'll let you have your little tantrum, Job, but now I'm going to talk, and it says,
answer me like a man.
Yes, exactly.
I love that.
And that's exactly right. And so I was railing at God, saying, you don't know what I've been through, and you don't know how I feel, and you don't care. And this was what came. It says, this is God speaking to Job, or in this case, God speaking to Ashley. Who is it that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man, and I will question you, and you shall answer me. So that's God talking to Job. And it says, where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footing set? And who laid its cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy. Who shut up the sea behind doors when it burst forth from the womb? And when I made the clouds its garments and wrapped it in thick darkness, when I fixed limits for it and set its doors and bars in place, when I said, this far you may come and no further. Here's where your proud waves halt. And it just goes on. I mean, it's a pretty long chapter, but it goes into, can you bring forth the constellations in their seasons, or lead out the bear with its cubs? Do you know the laws of the heavens? Can you set up God's dominion over earth? Can you raise your voice to the clouds and cover yourself with a flood of waters? Like, basically, God just goes through all of these elements of nature down to knowing where the lioness gives birth to her cubs. Like it was him just communicating to me, like, not only do I know, but I was there. Like, even when you were 4 years old, the first time that girl touched you when you were hiding in a closet, you weren't there by yourself. The night that you could have been gang raped in a hotel in Vegas, you weren't there by yourself. Like, I was sitting on the balcony with you. And not only did I see all of it, I sent the maids that let you back into that hotel room so that you could leave. I kept you from getting any diseases. Like, I have no diseases, which is unheard of. I was an escort for 5 years. I was never beat. I was never raped. I was never drugged. I was never, like, things that are very, very consistently awful in that line of work. I didn't experience any of it. And it's because God was there. And reading that passage of scripture, and I probably read it several times a week still, brought me so much healing, because it made me see that he does know. And not only does he know, he cares. Like, and whenever you really start understanding the depth of God's care for you, things just suddenly become, I don't want to say small, because it doesn't make the things you have been through small. It just makes you feel like you just didn't have to carry it by yourself.
Yeah. I want to read something, because there's a lot of stuff that I've been through in my life. I haven't been through what you've been through, but I've been through stuff. And there's one particular passage that God, because I think we always need passages in scripture that helps us in different things speak differently. But this is what God gave me, that really, really ministered to me and really kind of took a lot of the weight from me. And because it really, well, I'm just going to read it. It's in Revelation 21. So at the end of Revelation, everything is basically done. Like, everybody that has rejected God is separated from God eternally. And this is for people that have chosen God. This is what it says. And this, the Apostle John wrote this. He had a vision of the future, and this is what he wrote. It says, verse 21, I'm going to read 5 verses. Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and first earth had passed away, and there was no more sea. Then I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, behold, the tabernacle, the dwelling place of God is with men. He will dwell with them, and he will be with his people. God himself will be with them and be their God. God will wipe away every tear from their eye. There will be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There will be no more pain, for the former things have passed away. Then he who sat on the throne said, behold, I make all things new. And he said to me, write, for these words are true and faithful. And I have a really hard time reading that and not getting choked up, because the things that we go through that God didn't intend for us to go through are so radically devastating. But there's a day coming, if you put your faith in Jesus, if your hope is in Jesus, if you give your life to him, just like you did, where he took the pieces and put it back together. And one of the things you told me is the person that went through that stuff isn't there anymore. Like, she's gone, completely new. But one day, all the hurt that we have, it's going to be gone, and we're going to be in this perfect, I can't talk. We're going to be in a perfect place for all eternity. And like, that gives me hope, because
Hmm.
the stuff that I carry around, it's unbearable. And even for me, there are, I'll be quite honest, there are things that I use 4-letter words to describe because there's no other words.
Hmm.
I am I don't use profanity on a normal basis, but there's things when I talk about, I'm like, I don't have other words for. I don't know.
Yeah.
Like, I need that strong language to convey the meaning of it. I'm not cursing aimlessly, but I'm like, I
Right.
don't know how to, but I just, yeah. So that's the passage that God gave me, and I have to read it more often than not.
Hmm.
And it just brings a dash of healing when I really, really,
Yeah.
really need it.
Yeah. I think the other passage that I think about is that God bottles up our tears. Like no tear is wasted. Like he catches them all in a bottle. Um,
Yeah.
it's, he's just so good. And, for me personally, I learned so much about God the Father through my children. Um,
Oh my gosh, yes. Even
yeah.
even without trauma, yes,
Yeah, absolutely.
God wants to teach you stuff about him through your
Yeah,
kids.
absolutely. And my kids, what I think about sometimes is like even the stupid decisions that I make, like the prodigal type stuff. Like another point of healing for me is that I know because of as a mother, I want a real authentic relationship with my kids. I don't want them to lie to me. I don't want them to BS me. I would rather know ugly truths and truly know them to know pretty platitudes and not know them at all.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think that's just how God is with us. Like if I'm struggling with something, he wants to know. He wants me to tell him like this is hard for me and I'm struggling with this. Or whatever the case may be. And he doesn't need to be protected from us.
Yeah.
He doesn't need to be protected from our emotions. He doesn't need to be protected from the big feelings that we feel when we're processing these things. And knowing that I can just be that transparent with God, and knowing that, like you said, there is going to be a day when the pain and all of that is gone. Um, just brings so much freedom to just be truly authentic with him and with other people. So.
Well, this is definitely stuff that we could talk about for exhaustively. Like there's not enough time to talk about this stuff, and there's not
Mhm.
enough time to go into all the details. There's not enough time to talk about the way that sexual abuse impacts people. And I mean, like, as extreme and crazy and horrible as, the beginning of your story is, because now there's redemption and beauty in where you're at now. Uh,
Mhm.
there's so many other people that have had similar experiences, but went in completely different directions. I mean, it's such a big thing. That like, there's just not enough time for us to go through
Yeah.
it all.
Yeah.
But I want to encourage everybody. There's hope. You don't have to stay where you're at. I can't say that enough. One of the things that I think is really important to understand is it's hard to find good help sometimes.
Mhm.
Sometimes it feels like when you're dealing with this kind of stuff, it feels like there's not a lot of good help, and it feels like the help that's there is hard to find. A lot of times I think people that are in those situations don't even realize they need help. And then when they're like, hey, I need help, I need to get out, they don't know how to get the help they need. But it really does start with being honest about your situation, being honest about what's going on. Not because, like, there are people that will make excuses for their abusers. They're going to excuse it away because they've been conditioned to, or they've been groomed or whatever. And you've got to be honest, starting out being honest about your situation. And some people are, and they're still stuck there, but, and then finding somebody to talk to,
Mhm.
being able, and there's so much shame, and we don't want to talk about that when it happens to us. We don't want to open up. We don't want anyone to know. But the reality is there are people that will care about you and they won't look down on you. They won't talk to you the way that your abuser does. They're not going to put the blame on you. They're
Mhm.
not going to say, well, why did you do? The only thing they're going to be concerned about is, how can I help this person?
Yeah,
And
right.
again, I'm going to have numbers in the description of this for if you need help, you can contact Ashley. I'm sure she would love to help anybody.
Mhm.
Again, me also, the same thing. You know, one of my, yeah, anyway, so one last thing I want to do, Ashley, I want to give you the chance to say anything else you want. I do this at the end of every show. You can talk about whatever you want. I know this is probably not going to be it. You know, if you want to talk about the Super Bowl this weekend, that's fine. But and I'm not saying that, but like whatever you want, anything you
Yeah.
want. If you're secretly a Pokemon nerd and you want to talk about that, which I don't think you are, but whatever you want to talk about, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say first and foremost, if you have experienced any sort of sexual trauma, you have nothing to be ashamed of. The person that should be ashamed is the person that victimized you. The shame does not fall at your feet, it falls at theirs. And I know that at this moment, if that's something you're struggling with, that's very difficult to wrap your mind around because they're so great at gaslighting you that it's really easy to take the blame upon yourself. But the truth is, speaking of lies and the truth is you are not shamed and you are not condemned. And you know, as Chris said, if you want to reach out to me, you are welcome to reach out to me. I and if you are kind of in a place where you are wanting to kind of explore church and faith a little bit, but you're not real comfortable with the traditional model of church, you are 100% welcome with our church, which is 12XII Roman numeral 12 church is the website. You can find it on Instagram. You can find it on TikTok. We are a band of misfit toys, all church kids who've dealt with church hurt, who create safe spaces for people who are questioning God, who genuinely want to work out their faith and figure it out. It's a safe space to do that. You can ask questions. You can, our services are on YouTube every single week. They're only 12 minutes long. So if you don't have a lot of time, we don't film our church services in church. We film them in grimy hotels, and we film them in train yards, and we film them in Ferris wheels, and like our church is very non-traditional. So if that's something, if you're just wanting to know more about God and want a safe space to do that, you are 100% welcome at 12 Church. And then, like he said, if you need to talk or you need resources, or if you are in a situation where you or someone you know is being trafficked, please, 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 reach out to me. I will get you as many resources as I can to help you with that. All of my social media is the same. It's Miss Ashley Lagos, MSASHLEY LAGOS. It's on Instagram, TikTok, all channels. That's me. And I would be more than happy to help out. And yeah.
Wow. One of the things you'd mentioned, I just want to bring up, because again, this is a topic that there's so many things that we can talk about and address, and we just can't exhaust them all. You had mentioned gaslighting. And I think there are people that don't realize that they haven't heard the term, or they don't know what it is. And I just want to real quick, I'm not trying to mansplain anybody. You brought it. Okay. I'm not going to mansplain. You give up the explanation of gaslighting, because I can do it, but I want you to be able to do it.
Yeah, gaslighting is basically when somebody takes an element of truth, twists it around, and manipulates it to make you feel bad about whatever the situation is. That's the most simplistic version that I can give. So essentially, for instance, a way that an abuser would gaslight someone is by saying, for instance, when the man that raped me, he said, well, it's really your fault because you've been teasing me with your body for years. Well, that's gaslighting. Like, it was not my fault. I wasn't teasing him with my body. I didn't even know how.
Right.
But instead of taking ownership for what he did, he twisted it around and made it my fault because I was just so sexually alluring. Please hear the sarcasm in my voice at 14 years old, that he just couldn't withstand it. And so now it became my problem. And that's what gaslighting is.
Yeah. And then one of the ways it plays out like on a bigger scale is, like if you have an abusive spouse and the couple is going to counseling, the abusive spouse or partner will like whoever's being abused will explain, well, this happened. And the abuser will explain it to the psychiatrist in a way that shifts the blame onto the one who's being abused. And they're
Right.
so abusers are so manipulative and controlling. They're very good at making people think they are the most wonderful person in the world. Very often they're charismatic and well liked because they
Right.
work at that. And so in a counseling setting, the counselor may side with the abuser. I'm
Right.
not saying this is like typically what happens. This is just kind of how they use gaslighting. So if you're
Right.
but they'll work to get the counselor to believe them as the abuser instead of the victim. And the
Yeah.
victim will often walk away going, what in the world just happened?
Happen. Yeah.
And they
Yeah.
will even convince, oftentimes someone who's gaslighting will even convince you that, no, you're wrong. It didn't really happen the way you remember. So, yeah. So anyways, again, that's one of a million things. We're out of time. But this was such an important thing that I just kind of wanted to make sure that we got as much as we could in.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Ashley. I'm going to get, again, I'm going to get phone numbers for some different help resources in the description of this video. Ashley's contact information, the church information she was talking about, I'm going to have to check that out. That sounds great.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to check that out. All that information will be in the description of this video. So this has been the Crazy God Story podcast. It's available for free on a bunch of different platforms. It's on Spotify, Anchor. The video will be on YouTube. It's also on Apple Podcasts. If you want to support the ministry that God's doing through me, you can subscribe to this on Patreon. It's the same podcast there. You just get Crazy God Story merchandise. That's the only difference. So anyways, have a good afternoon. And again, if you need anything, please get help. There is help. If you don't find it in the first place, go somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.